Well, it's been another week of pointed fingers in the House of Commons. The government claiming it's being transparent. The opposition says that's hogwash. The issue, Canada's role in Iraq. Andrew and Chantal are here in Toronto. Bruce is in Ottawa tonight. I'm going to show you a clip, an exchange in the House of Commons between the Leader of the Opposition, Tom Mulcair, and the Minister of Defence, Rob Nicholson. Today gives you an indication of what it's been like a lot this week. Watch this.
There is nothing more important that this Parliament decides than whether or not we send our brave women and men to war, and we can't even get a straight answer.
What is duplicitous is the Leader of the Opposition suggesting or implying that he might ever support any of these missions, Mr. Speaker. We know that's not going to happen.
So just a taste of what it was like all week. Were they getting straight answers? Andrew?
Well, I'm not sure they were asking straight questions to begin with. They had the appearance of that, and it was, look, it's always theater. This was better theater than we've had in the past, but it's still theater. A lot of the questions were questions they knew the government couldn't answer. In some cases, the questions are going to be answered tomorrow, probably, when the government unveils what it's going to do on this. The presumption in that question that we saw in the clip that it's Parliament's role to decide on these things is not actually a legal or constitutional requirement. It's a courtesy that governments have recently been doing. So all I'm saying is it's better to see them behaving this way. We didn't learn a great deal, no, but presumably we're going to learn that tomorrow. But it's still, at the end of the day, it's politics and partisanship.
Different than we saw last week, though, a different level of politics and partisanship, I think. Chantal?
Slightly more adult, slightly more to the point. I would be willing to bet, and I won't lose any money on this one, that if we were not in the lead up to an election and we were 6 months after an election, the entire tenor of the questions and the answers would be different, because there is political play on both sides of the House at this point. For sure, also in other jurisdictions, Great Britain, to name one, but not exclusively, it seems that governments have been able to come to the opposition parties with better answers a lot more quickly. So why are we so slow?
Bruce, where are you on this?
Well, I do think things are different this week, Peter. I think probably the person who was the most annoyed with the way that Mr. Calandra handled his question last week was the Prime Minister. Judging from the way that the Prime Minister dealt with questions this week, he wasn't exactly forthcoming with detail about what he was thinking about, what factors he was considering, but he was careful to adopt a tone that I think more Canadians would find in keeping with the seriousness of the issue that he's trying to decide. There's no good options for the Prime Minister here. He faces only risk. There's really almost no chance that there's an upside for him politically in this mission. He could reduce the risk by bringing opposition leaders a little bit closer to him and talking about the issue with them. He hasn't chosen to do that. In the meantime, I think the opposition leaders are doing essentially what they're paid to do, which is to put some pressure on the government to force the issue into the public light.
But they're also putting a spin on it. Mm-hmm. Harper's War, sending troops in arms way. One day saying this, the other day saying only 26. The focus of it is embarrassing the government as much as eliciting facts.
I was going to say, I think that's true, but I think that by not giving a little bit more information out, the Prime Minister is encouraging that kind of opposition attacks, and I think he could reduce the risk of that.
Particularly in the context of everything that the government has done in the previous 6 years. I mean, it has established this kind of modus operandi, which the opposition parties are now trying to highlight. As I say, it's all kind of pointless because we're presumably going to find out tomorrow what the government's plan is, which they've been demanding all week, and we're going to find out, one hopes, their explanation as to what their thinking is, what the strategy, et cetera, is. If they don't, then at some point, absolutely, the opposition can say we're just flying around in the dark here, but it does seem to be a little bit premature when we know they're going to announce it tomorrow.
You know, Chantal, you made an interesting point to me in an email the other day, saying when you were watching the language of question period, the use of the Iraq war term by the opposition, but not by the government, was interesting.
And interestingly enough, I think Jean Chrétien gave the opposition, in particular the Liberals, a cue on that when he gave an interview and said, our arm is now in the ringer of another Iraq war. And you could see yesterday the Prime Minister trying to walk away from that vocabulary, because I think that the Conservatives, possibly a bit late, understand how this is probably the worst label that you can put on it. That goes both ways, though, because if one of the opposition parties decides to back what the government announces tomorrow, they're going to be stuck with the label that they pushed on over the past week.
Well, and you also saw though, Bob Ray intervening with an article in a newspaper that was more favorable to participating in this. So I think it shows you the pressures that Justin Trudeau is in, among others, is that he doesn't want to be seen, to pick up Chantal's point, he doesn't want to be seen, giving the kind of argument the NDP are making, he doesn't want to be seen to be too close to the government on this, but he's going to have a faction within the Liberal Party and within the Liberal electoral base that thinks that we should be doing this.
We'll get to Justin Trudeau in a minute because he had an interesting day today with some of the things he had to say. But let me just check with Bruce. One assumes that all the parties are doing some kind of research on this, on how it's flying with Canadians, and this whole sense of going to Iraq. You're a pollster. You've been in the field doing stuff. Have you seen anything on this particular issue that piqued your interest?
I've seen a few things that are a little bit dated right now, but Peter, if I had to guess based on the things that I've looked at in the past and different emissions for Canada, here's what I imagine we would find. Most Canadians would say, yes, we should do our part. What our part is open to debate. Troops on the ground, people would be quite hesitant about, I think. Airplane strikes, they'll be more supportive of, but skeptical about whether they would work. But the biggest question here, I think, isn't what people think about the specific combat missions that, realistically, they're not experts at analyzing, but how do they feel about the judgment of the Prime Minister and the motives of the government? And I think that's what the Prime Minister has been on the lookout to try to correct for. The flippancy that we saw last week is something that he knows is a risk that he can't take.
All right. Justin Trudeau gave a speech today that most people said the speech was pretty good on this whole issue of Canada's potential role in Iraq. What they wondered about was the question and answer session he got into later, and this particular answer about Canada in Iraq. Watch this.
Why aren't we talking more about the kind of humanitarian aid that Canada can and must be engaged in, rather than, trying to whip out our CF-18s and show them how big they are? It just doesn't work like that in Canada.
All right, it got a laugh in the room. It got a response from the PMO. They put out a statement condemning the last half of those remarks. And there have been others, too, who have been wondering whether or not that was the brightest thing that Justin Trudeau could have come up with on today. Where are we on this?
It is not the comment of a serious statesman in time of war. There's a context here as well, which is he's made several of these kinds of flippant remarks in the past. But the issue to me is not that it was off color or that it was a joking about a serious matter. It's what it reveals about his thinking, or at least about the kinds of thinking that he wants to appeal to. There's any number of serious questions to be asked about this, about the whole mission, about what's the mix between military and non-military. Should the international community be involved, or should it just be the countries in the region? Airstrikes versus ground troops in the ground. But to reduce all of that down to, well, first of all, to reduce it down to, he doesn't seem to have any problem with a military mission in general. He just thinks that Canada shouldn't be part of it for reasons that he himself has not explained. But then to reduce it to this kind of thing, well, it's boys with their toys and it's testosterone and macho displays, which was the implication of that joke. There's no doubt there'll be a certain constituency for that will be, shaking their head and saying, yeah, that's what this is about. But it's not a particularly mature way of approaching a very serious situation.
Bruce?
It's certainly a winsable moment, Peter. I think I had a chance to read the speech a little later this afternoon, and what I saw in the speech was actually a fairly cogent set of arguments, a more thoughtful piece than that clip suggests. And one of the arguments that he was fleshing out there was the idea that the government seems to fall back on this idea that it's just noble to go to war and to be in combat. And he was trying to contrast his thinking about that. I think it was an unfortunate quote, but I think it spoke to a point that was probably worth making for him. The bigger challenge with the quote, I think, isn't that it was at odds with his basic message, but it was at odds with the idea that he's a more statesman-like figure, which is, I think, something that he's had to work on.
Well, as he knows, I'm sure by now, it's that kind of quote that will live the day, not his speech. Chantal?
I'm sure that if Liberal strategists were watching that moment happen, they wish they could rewind that tape and not have it happen and not have it play tonight. That's not what they would have chosen. I too read the speech. I thought it was useful to kind of frame the Liberals' view or of whatever comes tomorrow. It could have been delivered in the House of Commons, though, for a party that is forever complaining that the Prime Minister goes out in the field whenever he has something significant to say. But I would also say, and that is unrelated to this particular debate, that this is exactly the kind of moment that many Liberals dread and many New Democrats and Conservatives hope for in the next election campaign, something that takes you off message. If this were a campaign, this would be a lost campaign day for the Liberals.
What should we look for when this eventually comes down to a vote? What will the vote tell us about these three parties? Obviously, we know where the Conservatives will be. We think we know where the Liberals will eventually end up.
You
And-
do, eh?
Yeah.
I'm glad
You
someone...
got the Liberals.
Well, yeah.
Yes.
Now, but it seems that they'll be on side.
They're certainly
with.
making that kind of noise. Oh, you think it'll be on side with the government?
No, you're not.
I was
I'm
reading
not
his body language
convinced.
the other way, but
I'm not convinced of that.
Well, it started that way, and then it's been
he's
shifting
been
around.
he's had several different positions.
That,
in the last couple of years.
that
has.
is why I was asking my question. Peter, you do?
Where are you, Bruce? Where do you think they're going to be, the Liberals?
Well, at this moment, I think it's in the interest of all three of these parties to have as little daylight as possible between them in terms of what the government proposes and what they're willing to support. I think that they're better off if they all find themselves in a situation where opposition parties are maybe arguing that they don't like some aspects of this, but they're going to go along with it. However, for them to do that, the Prime Minister needs to, in the way that he lays out the mission in his recommendations, he needs to make a plea for their support and try to persuade people to follow him, if you like. That's not a role that he's normally very comfortable in or interested in, so it'll be interesting to see what he does.
He'd probably prefer if they were on the other
Well,
side.
they wrote off
He
the
shouldn't,
MDP
though.
in the House today. Was that not the answer that Nicholson gave to Mulcair? We know you're never going to back us. I'm curious as to what the Liberals do, because I remember vividly a time when some of them voted to pursue the mission in Afghanistan and others did not.
The strategy of the NDP, the broader strategy, is absolutely clear: is to make the message that the Liberals will not offer real change from the Tories, that only the NDP can. So he's in a real bind on that if he does vote with the government. I think the Prime Minister has to look, as Bruce was saying, statesmanship, like he's trying to reach out, even if in fact he's not. And I think it wouldn't bother him at all if he was the only party on side with this. Final point I would make is, we talk about this as if we're about to launch, a flotilla of 200,000 troops over there. We're talking about, we've got 26 people on the ground now, and we might add 5 jets. So there's a certain amount of exaggerated stakes involved.
Who knows what
Well,
else.
I'd say it could go further than that. But at this point, we're talking about, a fairly small, fairly routine assignment.
Well, these things do add up quickly, and they do add up in cost as well. Sorry, Bruce, we're going to have to cut you off there because we're out of time. But Bruce is in Ottawa this weekend, Chantal and Andrew. By next week, we'll know what those votes are, and we'll see who was right and wrong. Got a feeling you know, or you think you know who's wrong.